Stamford, in the county of Lincolnshire, is one of England's most beautiful and peaceful market towns. Yet beneath this mellow stone facade, there's been over 1,000 years of turbulent history, which is now just waiting to be rediscovered.
And down here on the banks of the River Welland is where our day out is to begin. Because the reason that Stamford grew up where it is because of this river. This used to be the only place for miles around where the river could be successfully crossed. The lowlands on either side of it were liable to extensive and repeated flooding.
And although the Romans didn't actually build a town here, they did lay a stone ford across the river further upstream. Their armies marching up and down Ermine Street would have crossed the river here between the nearby encampments of Castor and Great Casterton. And it's said that during the Roman occupation, Queen Boudicca crossed here in hot pursuit of the 9th Legion in 61 AD. And it's from that Roman stone ford that Stamford gets its name. The settlement prospered under 2 centuries of Saxon rule, enough so to be granted a mint by King Edgar in the year 972. Around that time, Stamford began to grow in size in 2 separate locations. The main part, built within the town walls, developed on the rising northern bank, whilst a smaller hamlet, known now as St Martin's, began to take shape on the other side of the river. After the Norman invasion of 1066, Stamford became a heavily fortified town. To protect that all-important river crossing, a strong castle was built. But some 400 years later it was demolished to make more room for a then expanding and thriving market town. Today, sadly, all that remains of what must have been an impressive Norman castle is just part of the Great Hall. The river was once used for transporting goods to and from market. A few shallow draft barges did manage to navigate the water this far inland, for Stamford, already distinguished by the 9th century for its pottery, had by the 12th century become one of England's important wool towns. Trade, though, started to decline, and it wasn't until the 18th century and the influence of the Great North Road that a new lease of life came to the town. The George of Stamford, at the bottom of St Martin's Hill, would have been a famous landmark to travellers some 200 years ago. The hotel stands on the site of an earlier inn which was here in medieval times. The main buildings we see today date from the 17th century, but as coaching trade increased and there was always need to accommodate more guests, the hotel grew in size. And it wasn't just ordinary guests. At least 3 kings have spent the night here. The sign advertising the George would have been a comforting sight to those weary coach travellers in the 19th century, for this was a busy road with over 70 coaches passing through here in just one day. But with the advent of the motor car, a bypass road was built, diverting traffic away from the centre, and it's left the town a museum piece from a pre-industrial world. The parish church of St Martin's stands partway along the High Street. Construction was started by the Bishop of Lincoln in 1430. Years ago, this area was probably the southernmost boundary of the town, and if we take a look inside the church, we'll start to reveal some of the history of Stamford itself. Built entirely from local stone, it has an amazingly light and spacious interior, owing to the number of large stained glass windows, many of them carrying glass from other older churches from the surrounding districts. To the north of the chancel stands a magnificent monument to Sir William Cecil, who was the Lord High Treasurer of England during the reign of Elizabeth I. He was also responsible for the building of Burghley House, which lies a mile or so south of the town. The effigy, richly carved from marble and alabaster, lies on top of the tomb. He's dressed in his full armour and carries the badge of the Order of the Garter. When Sir William died in 1598, as a mark of his importance, the funeral service was held at Westminster Abbey before his body was returned for burial here in Stamford.
In a small annex to the main churchyard is what must be one of the most unusual graves I think you'll ever find.
Here lies Daniel Lambert, reputedly the fattest man who ever lived in England, because when he died in 1809 at the age of 39, he was the amazing weight of 52 stone and 11 pounds.
He was originally a native of Leicester and the keeper of a local prison there. He was a normal, healthy child, although it was reported that his aunt was rather heavy. He was teetotal and a moderate eater, so it seems that his enormous weight must have been caused by some disease. He died, though, here in Stamford in a pub, and a wall had to be demolished in order to remove his body.
And not surprisingly, his coffin was so enormous that it actually took 22 men to lower it into this grave.
Although he'd been the keeper of a local prison, apparently he was a very witty and courteous man. After he retired and moved to London, he used to admit visitors to his home at the cost of 1 shilling. Not to look at his vast body, but to enjoy a stimulating conversation.
Apparently one woman, overawed by his immense size, asked the cost of his coat. He humorously replied, "If you'd like to make me a present of a new coat, then you'll know exactly what it cost." And as a reminder of his enormous proportions, this, the only surviving suit of clothes, is now on display in the local museum in Broad Street.
You can't help but notice how many well-preserved buildings there are in this town. These here in Barn Hill are Stamford's pride and joy. In fact, it's amazing for a small town that there are so many beautiful buildings.
Stamford was the first town in the country to become defined as a conservation area. In fact, there are now over 600 properties of architectural or historical importance. These mellow houses, built from locally mined grey stone, have been tightly packed into the once limited space available inside the old town walls. During the Middle Ages, the streets began to grow in a haphazard fashion. There was certainly no planning, as there would have been in a Roman town, and definitely no room for gardens, which would have been absolute luxuries. At the start of this century, the town, somewhat feeling the pinch as its market trade reduced, didn't expand outwards. In fact, streets became narrower as more and more houses were built, creating a complete network of alleys and passageways, some of them only barely wide enough to walk down. But just occasionally you'll find yourself in an open area, such as this one. It's St. George's Square. The houses are grouped around the parish church, making it seem like a separate village in its own right. And whether the houses be elegant or quaint, they each have their own hidden story to reveal.
Well, Dr. Till, you've lived in Stamford for over 50 years, and I know you've made the town's architecture something of a life study. What can we see looking at your house?
Well, you see a townhouse that is built in the middle of the town. It is, as you see, a 6-bay facade, which means that it's impossible to have a symmetrical entrance. But mostly, in Stamford, asymmetrical entrances mean entrances that have been displaced from their original position.
And what about the house next door?
Well, that, of course, is a typical Stamford house, counting the bays, 5 bays with a symmetrical entrance, narrow corridor inside, rooms opening off each side. Like all these 18th century houses, it's had many illustrious occupants. The editor and printer of the Stamford Mercury, a very ancient newspaper. But it is a quite simple affair, and with a facade that probably doesn't cost more than £100 or so. Well, now let's come to look at this next house. a cheap job. It cost £100 to build this facade in 1771, and in the 1840s a foundry owner lived here. His foundry was behind in Wharf Road, and he ran up these pilasters in metal. Obviously, in a slack moment at his works, it would cost practically nothing, whereas a cooper job executed by a joiner would have cost very much more.
That has even fewer bays.
Only 4, but you notice that there is, in theory, an extra bay right at the west end where there's an entrance. Now, across the road is one of a line of interesting cottages, particularly number 1, antiques. You'll notice these very florid architraves, surrounds to the windows, which you might think are in stone until you look at the vertical cracks through the 2 right-hand keystones, which show clearly that they're in wood. Now look at 23 St. Mary's Street, with the sun still on it. A most subtle design from a London pattern book, the books that were circulated amongst provincial masons increasingly through the whole 18th century.
Rather like a woman sending off for a dress pattern. Was that
Yes,
a common
indeed.
practice?
Yes. All provincial buildings in the 18th century, more and more, were the product of metropolitan pattern book designs.
What appeals to you about that particular house?
Oh, it's far and away more graceful than any other house in that street. It springs from the ground, which is the real criterion of a satisfactory building. Wherever you look in the conservation area, you find these conforming Collyweston stone roofs, a native material, mined 4 miles away, and always used until well on in the 19th century in Stamford. And lastly, wherever you go, your view is stopped by a natural end to the curve. And that means that all these view stops, constantly changing along each street, are vitally important to the visual welfare of the whole of the conservation area here.
Over the years, Stamford's never been short of a church or two. This one is All Saints, with its spire rising 152 feet above Red Lion Square. The town's always been very religious, for at the end of the 13th century there were known to have been at least 6 monasteries and priories, 6 religious colleges, and no less than 14 churches. The earliest of these buildings, which still stands today, is St Leonard's Priory. It's about half a mile outside the town centre and was founded 900 years ago as a Benedictine monastery. But the present building is part of the old church, and considering its age, has survived amazingly well. It stands now, though, in the middle of an overgrown field awaiting restoration. St Michael's Church, built in 1836, stands in the now busy pedestrianised High Street. It was closed a few years ago as people moved away from the centre of the town, so someone had the bright idea to convert it into shops. But the residents were up in arms, though, when they found a discount motoring centre had opened. and if we walk up the pedestrian area, we arrive in Broad Street. It's unusually wide considering the lack of space elsewhere in the town, and consequently has been used as a market area from earliest times. On the northern side of the street stands a magnificent example of a medieval almshouse called Brown's Hospital, which is now open to the public. It was founded by William Brown, a wealthy wool merchant in the late 15th century, and was originally built to house 12 poor people, 10 men and 2 women. The common room on the ground floor used to be bedrooms, the area being divided up into 10 cubicles for the men, somewhat cramped by modern-day standards. Upstairs in the audit room is a beautiful example of a refectory table dating from 1583. But it's this piece of furniture that intrigues me. A massive wooden chest. It was used to store valuables, if they had any, and to hold local records and books. I notice it has 3 locks on the front. That's an early security measure, for 1 key each was held by the vicar, the warden, and one of the poor men, well known for his discretion and his moral bearing. And in the beautiful 15th century chapel at the east end of the building stands an impressive Tudor screen, carved from local oak, which has surprisingly managed to survive the ravages of time. And I'm sure you'll agree that the light through these large stained glass windows gives the chapel an appealing charm and warmth. If you look carefully, you'll notice 2 of the windows contain the figures of the Madonna and the Trinity, each with their very unusual jewelled crowns. Brown's Hospital is not strictly a hospital, but a hospice dedicated to the care of old people. Today, the homes are shared equally between men and women, although, as the Reverend Arthur Davis explains, there used to be 10 men, yet only 2 women.
One of the 2 women was a nurse to keep an eye on them, and the other used to help in cleaning and tidying up. And I suppose it was really a matter of accommodation. Probably William Brown, who was our founder, thought the small was beautiful and that they could look after a family if it were not too big. So they limited to 10 men and these 2 ladies.
And what type of people live here now?
Well, they're all old people, and they are provided with comfortable flats. We've got 8 single flats and 2 double flats.
Peaceful surroundings in which to relax and retire in later years. Friday, though, in Stamford is market day. There's been one here in Broad Street for as long as anybody can remember. With the town's important geographical position, traders used to come from miles around to exchange and barter goods. The town prospered during the Middle Ages and became well known for its dealings in stone, wool and corn. But the hustle and bustle of modern-day life hasn't affected these traders, only the items they have on sale. People still seem eager to sift through the rails of clothes or just mingle with the crowd, browsing from stall to stall. And there's always a brisk trade in fruit and vegetables, locally grown, of course, and the odd character or 2.
80 pence a pound, English roasting pork. All scored, all netted down for you, absolutely lean and lovely. Really beautiful. They are nearly £5.5 a pork, £4.35 for the 2 lovely joints. There's a beautiful big piece there. Oh, thank you. 80 pence a pound, Stamford. Anybody else? All done? All finished on rolled pork? You want it? Thank you very much, my darling.
And like any market town worth its salt, the pubs are open all day. You know, I'm sure that some only come for the beer. Historically, Stamford's never been short of a pub or 2. It was once said that there were as many pubs in the town as there were weeks in the year. And with all that beer being drunk, the town once had a thriving brewing industry. This type of dray used to be the method of transporting barrels of beer to the local alehouses a couple of 100 years ago. For during the 18th century, there were more than 22 breweries in the town. One of them, the All Saints Brewery, has now been carefully restored as a museum and is open to the public during the summer months. I asked one of the guides, Frank Roff, to take me for a tour around.
Frank, this is an enormous copper vat. What would have happened here?
Well, this is what they call a mash tun. And the malt comes down through the mill into here where it's all mixed up. Comes down through the grist case into the mash tun. The hot water, or liquor as brewers always call it, is sprayed onto it. The paddles do 1 revolution a day and mix all the mixture up, and the sparge arms just spray the hot liquor over it. From there, it used to be boiled in the copper for about 3 hours. Hops was added to give it the bitter taste to beer. There was rather an unfortunate accident in 1826 when a man was pouring the hops in, and he tipped it out and overcome by the fumes and went in with it. From there it used to be drained through the hop back, went into the fermentation vats where it used to stay for about 8 days. From there the yeast used to be skimmed off it, and then it used to be racked into a barrel. The whole process of this brewery was about 10 days, the whole process of brewing.
And all that drinking didn't seem to affect the town's academic qualities, for education's always been one of Stamford's strong points. But there's a strange story that I've found.
It all revolves around this gate known as the Brasenose Gate. Apparently during the 14th century, students, dissatisfied with their education at Oxford University, decided to set up a rival institution here in Stamford.
They stole the door knocker from Brasenose College in Oxford, and this, which unfortunately is only a replica, is all that's left of their unsuccessful attempt to make the town a seat of learning. Some 200 years later, though, Stamford School for Boys was founded, a fine array of buildings, including part of the old St Paul's Church, built during the 12th century. It was used for many years as a schoolroom, but later reconsecrated and served as the school chapel. Many famous people have been to school here, including Stamford's much-loved son, Sir Malcolm Sargent, the brilliant conductor who died in 1967. And one old pupil who remembers the school's long academic history is Bill Packer, who also taught here for 42 years.
Academic history of the school goes back a long, long time, very long-standing. And even in the mid-16th century, Libaeus Bayard, I think our first head, in his report was complimented on having brought great benefit to this town. This school is a very happy school, and one of the reasons why it is a happy school, I think, is because it always seeks to impart a strong sense of service to the community. And this has been reflected in the large number of old boys who later on have devoted themselves to the well-being of the town. Not only inside the town, but from the adjacent villages. Yeoman service, I would say, for which the town, I think, can be duly grateful. Stamford, you see, is special. It has more than an architectural heritage, and its people do have something. And I don't think it's because of the fact we had once 14 churches, or even due to 70 pubs. So it must be the schools, or perhaps it's something in the water.
To end our day out, we travel just a mile or so south of the town to visit the magnificent Burley House. Regarded by some to be one of the greatest houses of the period, this splendid example of Elizabethan architecture was built nearly 400 years ago by William Cecil, who was then the first Lord Burleigh. The house stands surrounded by delightful landscape gardens, the creations of the famous Capability Brown, who actually had the pleasure of staying at Burleigh a few times. There are more than 240 rooms, 8 beautiful staterooms, each containing a wealth of oil paintings, tapestries, and some exquisite pieces of antique furniture. This enchanting Queen Anne state bed stands in the black and yellow bedchamber. The bed and draperies are covered with embroidery, the product of many hours of patient effort. The pagoda room contains some of Burley's finest old masterpieces. It's like a who's who from history. And this bedroom, said to have been used by Queen Elizabeth I during a visit here, is named after her. But surely the most impressive sight is of the Heaven Room, painted from floor to ceiling by the Italian painter Verrio. The three-dimensional effect of the figures is almost eerie, but quite beautiful. So much so that on occasions when Queen Victoria stayed here, she insisted on taking breakfast in this room. And of course, no great house can cope without extensive kitchens. In fact, these large dark rooms form the oldest part of Burley House. There are more than 260 copper utensils on display here, which surprisingly until recently were still in daily use. And there's also an interesting collection of turtle skulls from the days when live turtles were brought into the kitchens to make soup. And if you're hungry to see more of the splendid Burley House, it's open daily from April to September.
And so we've come to the end of our day out in Stamford, and with this last look at Burley House in the late afternoon sunshine, I hope you'll remember Stamford as fondly as I do. Goodbye.